When you like something on social media, when you post something on social media, you're obviously providing information about where you are, what you're doing, and how you're doing it. All of this is potential evidence.
You're listening to Good is in the Details. I'm Gwendolyn Dolske.
And I'm Rudy Salo.
And this is the podcast where we learn what we didn't know in the spirit of Socrates, all with the aim of a more knowledgeable life, a happy life. Actually, Rudy, I watched this documentary. It's up for an Oscar. I was afraid to watch it because I was thinking it was going to be a little bit too hard because people have had emotional reactions to it. It's called The Perfect Neighbor, and it was making me think about our guest. Have you heard of it?
No.
Oh.
Can you just give a little bit about it?
Yeah.
If it's relevant to our discussion, let's talk about The Perfect Neighbor.
I mean, for you who enjoy film, this is very interesting. The documentary is almost made up entirely of body camera images from police officers. It is a case of a murder, racially motivated. The person who committed the murder wanted to hide behind stand your ground laws. This happened in Florida. The reason why it didn't work was because of her Google search history. It was making me think about Professor Ferguson's book. Our guest today, the author of Your Data Will Be Used Against You, Professor Andrew Guthrie Ferguson of George Washington University Law School, is writing about how technology has outpaced existing law in terms of what is probable cause, what kind of evidence can law enforcement get. This is something new. Like, you're in your home, you're Googling, I guess you're plotting a crime. But for a long time, we've considered inside the home kind of the ultimate privacy. Government can't reach in. But because of our Alexas, the Echoes, our phones, everything is changing this dynamic. And your home is also a source of data that, in the case of a crime, can be used because the law enforcement will go to the third party, who is the company, and collect all those records. So it's bringing up a lot of questions about where is your privacy? What is the rights of the individual? What is the concern of law enforcement? Yeah, big discussion.
I'm all about documentaries these days in classes. I'm actually working on one for the future of transportation. I love it. It was a great discussion today. And I stayed back because obviously I went to law school. I don't work in criminal defense. I don't work in data privacy. I don't work in those areas. But you have to know a lot about your constitutional rights. You have to know a lot about the history of the Supreme Court cases. You have to have general knowledge of the law. And I had a general knowledge of the law. So I thought the discussion was excellent as someone who has not gone to law school to ask the questions on behalf of our audience members who don't know a lot about the laws. And you were asking great questions, like your point, women searching about abortion options in states that's where it's now illegal, as well as like, well, wait a minute, when we give up rights, when we go to the airport for safety purposes, those are really, really good points. I stayed silent until the very, very end. And I spoke about why I'm comfortable with, data and privacy and knowing that, like, yes, this stuff can be used against you. And maybe you're an innocent person and you're doing some innocent research and you're doing some stuff and that's used against you and it can be twisted. Absolutely, that's horrible. But the overall case is this stuff is being used against people that are committing violent, terrible crimes. And this stuff can be important to getting a judgment against them where you have to have beyond a reasonable doubt. And these are important points. My comfort level with data collection and may not be the same for everybody, but I gave a reason why I'm comfortable with it because of my history and everything. But maybe that's not for everybody. But in general, this is a personal choice.
And we should just have that out there. I mean, that's part of the point of this is like, first, we need to know what is possible. And then we can have the discussion about the rightness or wrongness or comfort. What you brought up toward the end of the episode was really important because one of the questions is about targeted surveillance. It's a conversation that Professor Ferguson and I are having, and you were able to highlight, hey, you know what? There are groups, American citizens, who have been targeted and surveilled for a long time. And now this is becoming a conversation because it's a bit more even spread. As a philosopher, I'm talking in the abstract, like, oh, what is the right and justice and procedure? And you really brought me back home where you're like, hey, this is experience. This is concrete. This isn't just an abstract thing. This is something that people live with. I guess that's all I'll say about that. Okay, everybody, thank you so much for your clicks, your downloads, your shares. Anybody's interested in philosophy philosophy of law and about data, their social media, who is watching, who is going to look at your Google search history, check out this episode. You're going to want to hear it. You're going to want to share it. And also join us on Patreon, patreon.com/goodisinthe-details. Okay, we are going to be talking about our data and privacy and companies and law enforcement. We'll go ahead and dive in. Now I'm wondering, when you were studying law, did you do that with the intention to practice?
I'm an accidental law professor. I wanted to be a public defender when I was in law school, and I was for 9 years, essentially. After I clerked for a year, and then I was basically a public defender in DC, trying cases, real cases, doing all the work that you do as a public defender. And then I sort of transitioned into academia somewhat accidentally and found I loved it, but I did not have the idea that I would be a law professor at any moment before sort of the year before I moved over to do it.
How long have you been teaching law?
16 years now.
Okay, I think that will also be interesting when it comes to your book, which we'll be talking about. Your data will be used against you. One of the questions that I have, just from the point of view of being a professor for 16 years and then with working on this book, do you find a generational divide in the attitude toward surveillance?
I've seen a couple of shifts. I think that for a while, when I teach a seminar class on policing surveillance technologies, in fact, the book begins with me asking some of those questions that I asked students. And I think there were definitely a couple of years where students were, I'd say, almost naive or maybe blasé about sort of their data. They felt that they were digital citizens, that they didn't have privacy, and they were somewhat okay with that. And then post-Dobbs, the decision that turned abortion back to the states, I actually noticed a real shift because people recognize questions of when I Google, what are early pregnancy symptoms, or when I want to ask my mom for advice, that all of those digital clues could actually turn into data if someone were going to prosecute you for seeking abortion in a state that criminalized it. And so I watched the students see that the data was more targeted to them. And in some ways, I think it removed some of the privilege that was perhaps protecting them in other ways, like the aperture of surveillance has expanded to people who might otherwise not have been seen to be the target of police. And I actually see it even more right now because post some of the ICE practices or Customs Border Patrol practices in Minneapolis, where people who are protesting what the government is doing are now under surveillance, where communities who are just trying to protect their own community members are now seeing sort of a political prosecution being directed to them. I think people are even more aware of how what is crime can be redefined politically, and thus all of our sort of digital clues of where we go and what we do and what we're thinking and how we express ourselves are now potential evidence. And so I see this sort of message that your data can be used against you just hit home in a different way that has changed over the different years I've taught the same class. I see the reaction to the questions in a different way.
Yeah, it's so popular, the apps that are for women to track their menstrual cycles. And then even when I was pregnant, I had an app that showed me every day what was going on with my body so I could learn. And then just as you're saying, once that decision was made, then it became a concern. Women and girls were being told, ditch these apps.
And that's what's so hard. I mean, these apps and this information is obviously a really important thing for healthy living, for being able to take care of yourself. And the fact that something that would otherwise be good for you could be literally turned into evidence against you feels like such a betrayal. And the difficulty, the reason I wrote this book is that that's actually happening all across our digital lives, where we are buying into smart devices for good reasons, perhaps. You have a smart watch that tells you your blood pressure, when it's elevated or not, or you are trying to track your own health outcomes by living a more quantified life. Those are all good things. But without legal protections about what can we do with those data, it means that all of those pieces of information can be used against you. And I think in the abortion context, or whether you are, a family trying to raise a child who needs gender affirming care, the idea that your personal choices, your life choices about you and your family could suddenly be evidence in a criminal case is terrifying in a way that I think is awakening, like a moment to actually recognize that we have built these sort of systems of self-surveillance in a way that really leave us pretty vulnerable, sort of digitally naked to the world, just hoping that we don't become the subject of police attention.
Yeah. A few years ago, there was a book. I fell in love with it. It was by Dave Eggers called The Circle. Right. And so I looked up, it was published published in 2013, and it reimagined exactly what you're talking about, that it was corporations that were collecting information. It was a contrast to the wildly popular Warning of George Orwell's 1984, where that imagined a surveillance by the government. But then Dave Eggers created this system where you are constantly supposed to be posting online to the point where you don't even have a thought anymore. All of your activity is supposed to be online. You're socially punished if you do not constantly let everybody know about your trip or what you're doing. Because the idea in that book was that if you go on a holiday, for instance, and you do not post the photos of what happened, you are doing something wrong because you are depriving other people access of knowing about that place and how your trip was. So privacy was considered theft. In the same way, 1984, they convinced you that 2 + 2 = 5. The idea was that eventually all of this data would be used to influence elections. And this is written in 2013, before the explosion of Instagram, TikTok, and all of those other things. And then I'm reading your book now, 13 years later, and this seems to be a reality. I am interested in how technology outpaces existing law. And when I taught a course on this, one of the examples was the Titanic, that the Titanic, which was over 100 years ago, but that it was constructed in a way and didn't violate any laws. That's because the laws didn't fit what the Titanic was. And that example can't resonate in the same way. It impacted a small population. We were quite distanced from it. But now what you're writing about is a scenario that impacts all of us. There is no distance. So when technology is outpacing existing law, I think I want to be clear on what is the law right now and what can the law not account for when it comes to this technology.
So it's a great question on both points. So first, just in terms of how we have built sort of these digital like self-surveillance networks, if you think about your life, of how you connect to the world, whether it's through email or text or Google searches or AI searches or any of those things, you are leaving a digital trail. When you like something on social media, when you post something on social media, you're obviously providing information about where you are, what you're doing, and how you're doing it. All of this is potential evidence. Same with the data that goes into the smart devices in your home or your car or your body. All of this is eventually potential evidence that could be used, in part because of the second part of your question. There are really no strong laws that protect the government from getting access. The sort of agreement that we have both either formally agreed when we checked a few boxes and say, I agree, or just our norms is that we were willing to share this data with Google. When I type in a question to Google, I expect an answer back. And I knew there was some cost that I'd probably get an advertisement about the thing that I was interested in next to me. But I never thought that my Google search would then be used against me in a court of law. I was wrong to think that because currently the law does not protect us. And so if you think about in terms of criminal law, there are generally two ways you might be protected from the law. One might be constitutional law, the Fourth Amendment protecting against unreasonable searches and seizures, the limitation about whether police can get access to like your home or your computer or your smartphone. And depending on the technology we're talking about, the police may need a warrant or it's just available because you agreed to give it to Google. And if you give it to Google, well, you also can give it to the FBI. Why would they not get it if you can, reveal this to the FBI? And the other sort of source of law might be legislative, right? Your states or the federal government could make a determination that we are okay with you having and creating this data, but in order to get access, the police have to jump through certain hoops. Maybe again, it's a warrant requirement. Maybe it's something higher, but we could have a set of rules that we as a democratic polity agree upon, and we abide by that. Right now, the Fourth Amendment is decidedly analog. It really has not caught up to sort of the digital world of self-surveillance we're living in. And Congress hasn't done very much, and they certainly haven't tackled the difficult issues of data protection or privacy, or even the smaller issues of how police could use that. And while we've seen states develop sort of consumer privacy protections, almost all of those state protections have a carve-out loophole that allow law enforcement to get access if there's a criminal case and they have the requisite legal authority authority to do so. So the short answer is the law has not caught up with the new technologies, and we are all very vulnerable to having that data used against us.
What responsibility do you think that the media has? And I ask this because it seems to be that because the technology is new, that whenever I see a story about some data that is being used, it's always in a positive way that a crime was solved, like the Golden State Killer, for instance, because, we all want to be safe. And so when we think that somebody got away with something, and then we find out that there was this ingenious way that the detectives were able to use some sort of a digital footprint, we maybe are getting comfort in that fact because that is the way that those stories have been portrayed by the media.
I think your point is really very valid. I mean, and the book is actually filled with stories where bad people get caught using their data. And that's part of the story. There is a reason why police want this information. There are great use cases about how it could be used to solve probably unsolvable crimes. But right now, because of those positive stories, we have essentially left the data collection and use unregulated in the hopes that they would only be used in those good cases. And sometimes it's even harder than that. Let me give you a story out of the book, but I think it's really one of the more complicated stories that make you really wrestle with it. I think we can all agree that having something like a digital pacemaker, a smart pacemaker, is a good thing. It's kind of the innovations that we want to encourage in life, right? Literally, there's something that lives in your heart and keeps you alive, lets you know how your heart is doing or whether you need to go to the doctor, and gives data to your doctor to track whether or not your heartbeat is as healthy as it could be. Well, in the book, it talks about a story where detectives went to the doctor's office and obtained the gentleman's smart heartbeat to use against him in a court of law. Why? Because the gentleman happened to be involved in some insurance fraud where he was basically burning down his house and making up a story and then trying to claim insurance. And detectives thought this was an untruthful story that he was telling and knew that his heartbeat could very well be used against him. And that puts in the tension, right? The detectives aren't doing anything wrong. They are investigating a case and a crime. In fact, there was a crime. You shouldn't burn down your house and get insurance money. That's terrible. At the same time, I think we might recoil at the idea that our own heartbeat that is keeping us alive might become evidence against us in court. And what I sort of propose in the book and what I'm wrestling with in the book is there a way to have the best of both worlds, where we can actually have the consumer convenience of data that we want and we all use and we all rely on, at the same time come up with more protections that might create a different balance, where it's not just all available for police just because we've created it. And in some ways, that is the norm and default right now. We've basically created a system that if the data exists, police can get it, at least with a warrant, and sometimes without a warrant. And that means there is nothing too private, nothing in your life. As you mentioned, your period app, your digital diary, the data from your smart bed, the conversations, overheard by an Alexa in your bedroom. Like, there's nothing off limits to police without, if they have a warrant at best, and sometimes they don't even need a warrant. And what does that mean to privacy? What does that mean to our world that just because we've created it, it can be used against us?
I have so many thoughts because on the one hand, like you said, I'm reading these cases in which it was successful to apprehend a criminal. Then on the other hand, I'm extremely uncomfortable with this idea of information being collected when I'm in my home. I am thinking about, like one of the principles, as you mentioned here, that our legal framework is based around the rights of the individual. This kind of liberal system where the government is hands off and you can exercise your actions, your speech, and that the only way in which the government could curb your freedom is if there's the burden of proof that that freedom would cause some sort of harm. I'm stealing from John Stuart Mill here. And so in principle, it's so problematic because it really does feel like an overreach. Because if I'm just minding my own business, then why would this information need to be in some sort of a base? And let's just say if an administration the executive branch is involved in this, would the next executive branch say, maybe run on how awful that is, but then they see all the data and they're like, we're just going to hold on to it. We're not going to just put it up in smoke.
you're right to recognize that this is a danger no matter who's in charge. Like there really is. I think this is a bipartisan issue in some ways that, ironically enough, like Donald Trump believes his data was used against him and he's quite upset about it. People who are, Second Amendment stalwarts have for years worried that the federal government would be collecting data about who owns guns and worried that people would break down their doors and take away their guns. Well, with automated license plate readers outside of gun ranges and gun shows and where you buy ammunition, you don't need a list. You literally can find all the people who, by inference, have a gun in their house. And we've just created it by our surveillance world. But to your point of like the inversion of who is surveilled, what we've done now is basically change the default. It used to be, as you said, that the government would do what it was doing and only turn its targeting on you when you had done something to sort of flag that you had broken the social norms or laws of society. And then the investigative power would come to you. And we were somewhat okay with that compromise. But now with new technologies of, video cameras on the streets with AI embedded in them, facial recognition, automated license plate readers, sensors everywhere, we've kind of reversed the paradigm where you're always under surveillance. Like you're always under surveillance, even if it's not being used at that moment. It's your, panopticon of Foucault in philosophy, right? This idea that the presumption is you are always being watched in a way that feels honestly kind of un-American. Like this idea that we are just waiting for the government to use it or pick who is now the other, who is now the least powerful group to go target. Maybe it's your Antifa, whatever, however you're going to define that. Maybe it's supporting your community members who are supporting immigrants or undocumented folks in your community. The technology has caught it all. And now it's just about who has the power to use it or wield it in the way that they want. And I think that's a really discomforting place to be because you don't know who's going to be in power and you don't know how they're going to abuse it. The one thing you do know is most people in power actually do tend to abuse that power at some point or another. And so perhaps you want to build systems in place to protect against that potential abuse.
Do you see this ever going in the direction of the prediction business? For example, that the surveillance is at a point where then there's a section of the watchers who are using that pre-crime
So
and doing something.
Yeah. We've had a decade of experience, almost 15 years of experimenting with ideas of predictive policing. We either have like place-based predictive policing, where essentially because of past crime data, police will figure out that there's some kind of risk in this community, this area, and they'll send patrol cars to go patrol that area in the hopes of catching the predicted crime. Or individuals. They say, we think that these individuals, because of their past prior acts, was it arrests or convictions, use of force, use of guns, their own victimization, might be at a higher rate of risk for future offending. And so in Chicago and Los Angeles, they literally had lists. They were called the heat list in Chicago. It's called the laser program in LA, where police had a bulletin with like a picture and someone's background and said, these are the people in your community you should be looking out for. There was a question of what do you do with that? Do you just like go chat with them and say, hey, we're watching you because you made our heat list or our predictive policing list? Was it a sense of essentially a form of social control that would justify what police were probably going to do anyway of going to find these people? Was it trying to offer them social services? Chicago actually had a plan at one moment where they would literally knock on the door of the people who made the top of this list and say, hey, you made our heat list and here's a letter with potential like job opportunities and social services programs that you could have. It was a bit undercut because the person knocking on the door was a detective who probably really wasn't looking out for your best interest. But, if the idea was to tell the people who might get involved in criminal activity that they're being watched, it was a very effective form of sort of surveillance. And all of that was like pre-AI, honestly, pre-sophisticated algorithms. This was like simple sums of adding up risk scores and saying, here are your people. And so I imagine we will see the next generation of these predictive policing tools with AI associated with them, just because everything is now being sold with AI. And they'll say, look, we've crunched the numbers and we found of all the people in Chicago, this group of people is most likely to pull out a gun and use it. And so you're now on it. And the question is, what do you get to do with that information? But I guarantee we'll see that in the coming years.
Okay. I have so many thoughts. I'm also just thinking about when I voluntarily give up a lot of my rights when I go to the airport. For example, because of the interest of safety, when I go through security, I'm searched without probable cause. I don't have freedom of speech. My right to bear arms is suspended. But all of that is because I'm actively making the choice, and I would prefer the safety of being on the airplane. And so I'll let go of that. But that's such an isolated, small part of 1 year for me. And now what you're describing, it seems as though maybe with the promise of safety, I'm entering that just by virtue of existing. Is that fair?
Well, what you're going to do is you're going to see that same process, but at other spaces that have that same heightened concern about safety. So picture a sporting complex. Maybe it's a stadium where people are playing professional sports. There will be not only the equivalent of the TSA weapons thing, where they'll be looking for whether someone's bringing in a weapon. They'll have facial recognition to identify people there. You actually, in some stadiums, you can go buy beer and wine and alcohol because they have your face already and it's attached to your credit card. You can get through the lines faster if you've sort of pre-registered, kind of like a TSA pre-clearance, but to get through the sporting line, so you don't have to wait in line with your tickets. And so you'll see it there. You'll see it in government buildings where you already have to go and essentially show your ID, and someone in the front looks at your ID and writes down your name, and that's security. Now it'll all be facial recognition where it'll identify you against your ID to see it's you. You're going to start seeing those move to security in other sort of fixed spaces. Many universities now have pretty sophisticated safety systems, either camera systems watching the school, but also locks that are digital locks. When I go to my law school, I have a digital ID card that knows when I'm in and when I'm out and where I'm going. So presumably we will see this expand in a way, again, with a trade-off. These aren't necessarily being put upon you in the sense if you're not aware of it, you are aware of it. And we're making some of these trade-offs for a good reason. I think you and I, who go to an academic setting, would hope that that technology wouldn't necessarily be handed over to police. We might worry if our students were undocumented or without different immigration status, that they wouldn't be automatically turned over to ICE or that. But those are rules, right? We've built the system of surveillance and capture, but the rules about how they get used are still somewhat unwritten and need to be written, I think, in a stronger way.
Okay, so that's where I think I want to go, is with the rules and with the solutions, because one stat that you have in your book that took me by surprise, and it was, let's see, wait, I gotta find. Yeah. As of 2018, almost 90% of white people in the US could be identified through genetic genealogy. So even though I have not done any of those swabs to find out my history, there is a pretty good chance that I'm already in a database by virtue of being white and an American citizen.
Yeah. So one of the realities of sort of the rise of genetic genealogy and the fact that DNA from various private companies was such a popular thing for a while is that lots of people, kind of out of curiosity about their backgrounds or their heritage, gave their DNA quite willingly to private companies to get access to that information, right? No one forced them to give up their DNA. But the difficulty with some of these programs is that they were less protective of that information should, say, the FBI or a local police department wanted access to it. And so what you can do is not just obviously find the DNA match, you might have given up your DNA, so that'll be easy to find. But because some DNA is trackable through the other alleles in your DNA, and you can find family members. Usually it's through actually the male genes, but you could find other people. There have been databases created so that police can find people who never gave their own DNA up, but their family members did. And so, one way to think about it is you are private to the extent of your least responsible relative who decided that they were curious about your heritage. And it's too late to pull it back. The information's already out there. Some of these companies actually have, 23andMe actually went bankrupt for a while, and now it's up. So, it's a question what's going to happen to all that data? Some of the companies realized that the way to make money was actually to allow law enforcement to have access, so they were willing to do it. And again, if you are a company and a law enforcement agent with a valid warrant comes to you with a request, you can't really say no. It's like the law. You got to, if the judge signed off on it, you kind of have to give it up. Again, biological material is one example of how we have inadvertently exposed ourselves and our sort of larger family group to this potential world of government investigation.
That's what I was thinking, is that there's a financial interest for the company to hand over. So it's not as though the police or any investigation is going directly to the individual for the information. I mean, not at all, but they're going to the company that creates it. And so this would be a financial interest for the company because they're making a product that can be used this way. Is that part of it?
It can be, depending on the technology we're talking about. I mean, so most data-driven company, their value is the data, right? They want to collect it. They want more of it. The more they have it, the more they can do something with it. And sometimes for a while, it was just collect data. We don't know what we'll do with it, but it will be valuable to us some point. So there are two pieces to that. One is just like any other entity can go and buy that data if they have enough money and it doesn't violate the terms of service, so too can the government, right? We have a whole world where the government can buy like geolocation data. We're actually seeing it again in the immigration context where the ICE and Customs Border Patrol is buying sort of consumer data broker data about where people are located because it's available. And like if like a company trying to sell you blue jeans can buy it, well, why can't the federal government? So they're going around and buying data to be able to use to track people down. And that's just a consequence of creating a world where data is a commodity that can be bought and sold in different ways. The other reality, though, is even if it wasn't being purchased, the government doesn't even have to purchase it as long as they have a valid warrant. So if they go in with a judge's signed warrant, say, hey, we have a crime, you have evidence, we want it, the lawyers at the company, even if they don't want to give it up, don't have an option. And so you're thinking about DNA and a murderer, fine, but that's the same true with the period app, right? The young girl who's using a period app in Texas unknowingly or not thinking through what that means is if the company has that data and they get a lawful warrant request for it because they think some crime has occurred, they can't say no. Like that's just the rules of a U.S. company. The only way to say no is say, I don't have the data, or I can't get access to data through some measure of encryption or technological development, which is possible, but kind of undercuts the financial benefit of having all that data, which is the whole point of having a company based on data.
Do you think that people are going to get accustomed to this, or is there going to be some kind of a revolt? So in the same way, when a law is introduced, the people who are born into that law, they don't think anything of it because they don't know the before times. Like just something simple, when I get in the car and put on my seatbelt, I don't think anything of it. But at the time when that law was formed, there was this backlash that was an invasion of privacy, that a person should be able to do what they want in their own vehicle and the government shouldn't be regulating that. I don't think anything of it. Do you see that there's this possibility that people who are younger and in this are going to accept it as a way of being? Or what would be a law that you would suggest that needs to be put into place in order to prevent the trajectory of this collection?
Well, first is sort of like the cultural norm question, and then secondly, the law question. But the cultural norm question, I think, is interesting at this moment. Just a couple of weeks ago, there was a Super Bowl commercial with a Ring doorbell was advertising the ability to turn on all of the Ring doorbell cameras in a neighborhood to find the lost puppy, right? So it was supposed to be a heartwarming commercial about the new technologies to like save the lost puppy. And clearly, the folks at Ring who had invested whatever millions of dollars it takes to run a Super Bowl commercial thought this would be a positive. It turned out there was a huge backlash because people said, wait a minute, if you can turn on the camera to find the dog, you can turn it on to find anyone. And that means you're turning our camera systems into essentially a network of surveillance that we didn't consent to. And just within a week or so, they had to roll back this sort of launch that clearly was supposed to be a big deal launch because it was in the Super Bowl. And now there was pushback. And so to me, that signals that perhaps individuals and communities are not so comfortable with this sort of misuse or danger of a privacy invading technology. And maybe there is a moment to have this conversation. I hope that my book, which is trying to put together and pull together all of these different risks and potential solutions, might actually be a spark that people could have these conversations at home and decide whether they really have balanced out the need for these new technologies and what the risks are. And then maybe a spark to get Congress to respond to it. In terms of the legislative responses to it, like there's a whole chapter in the book about what legislators can do and whether that is sort of changing the balance of power of making something that is a stronger warrant requirement is one option. Again, like if you think about it, currently in the law, and since the late 1960s, we have allowed law enforcement to put a microphone in your living room and listen to what you're saying. It's got a wiretap. It's really invasive. It's about as invasive as you can imagine because they're literally listening to what you're saying. But we have been okay with that balance for a couple of reasons. One, there's a federal law that establishes when you're allowed to use it. It's limited to the most serious kinds of cases. You have to sort of assert to the judge there's no other way to get this information. You minimize the other data because obviously other people in the house whose voices might be picked up. about. And it's been a compromise that we have allowed law enforcement to do in the serious cases. Usually it's like the mob cases or mafia cases or whatever it would be. And yet it hasn't been abused in the same way that you might do it. And I think that one proposal you could do is to have that kind of higher level requirement to get some access to some of these smart devices and private devices that might change that balance. And so that's one of the many ideas in the book about how we really could respond to this moment where I think there is a concern. I sense it when people pick up the book and sort of read through it, that there is a sense, but people don't know what to do. And the hope for the book is to give us some tools. I don't have all the answers, but some tools to respond to this moment in time where we have built a network of self-surveillance around us and we're worried it's going to be used against us.
Rudy, I'm going to pause myself.
No, it's okay. Look, I didn't grow up in your world. I grew up in a completely different world, and all this stuff doesn't surprise me at all. When you grow up the way that I did, seeing things on TV, seeing, people paint you, your family, just because you're a member of a ethnic group as, terrorists to be watched. And you grow up like that, you're used to this stuff. And that's the truth. So you're always careful, even though it's crazy because I'm not that important. If I do commit any crimes, I'm sure they're all the crimes that we all commit, speeding and parking in red zones occasionally to pick up our kids. But you grow up with this paranoia and you always be careful what you type anywhere, even before this surveillance and all that stuff. You grow up that way. It's a big joke. You pick up the phone, you call up one of your relatives or your friends and go, oh, hey, FBI person, I'm just calling to say, you make these jokes, right? And you grow up seeing people who look like your relatives or speak the language that they speak at your church or anything in all the movies in the 80s and 90s, and they're just painted as terrorists, right? And they have all these movies of people watching you. And you're used to it. My wife and her dad talk about this stuff too, with the Minnesota and the ICE, everything. Like, oh my God, I'm a terrorist because I'm expressing my freedom of speech. Yeah, okay. You know what? Welcome to our world. And not only that, having known people that work and had worked at some of these government agencies that surveil people, guess what? We're really not that interesting. They don't really care about us. The vast majority of them really want to stop the bad guys.
Yeah.
And that's their goal. I totally get, Andrew, I'm not belittling anything at all. You just got to understand where I'm coming from, man. You know what I'm saying?
Yeah. And I think, when you read the book, you'll see that the issues of race are pretty clear. The fact that surveillance has always been directed against poor communities and Black and brown communities, and how one of the interesting things that I sort of play around with the book is how, in some ways, the rise of smart surveillance almost opens that aperture to get people who are otherwise privileged, who never thought that they would be the subject of surveillance, to see what many communities have seen all along. I was a public defender before teaching, and I know how surveillance was directed against my clients, who are all Black and brown men primarily. I think that what the book is trying to do is point out that the dangers that many communities have seen and know firsthand are expanding, and that might give an opportunity for people to speak out about it and listen to the people who could have critiqued it years ago, who have been critiquing it for years, but people haven't been listening to it in the same way. And so I think it's a very valid point. I also think that the truth is that all of these technologies we're talking about are still going to be weaponized against the poor and the powerless far more than they'll be impacting anyone else, and that privilege will still exist. The license plate readers are directed at poor communities and communities of color. The cameras are in poor areas and communities of color. And so what we're seeing now is kind of a supercharging of this same technology, again, directed against some of the same communities in possibly even more negative ways. It's a fair critique and point, but it's also, I think, actually pretty well addressed in the book.
That's what I was thinking, is that, let's say when it comes to substance abuse, drugs, that's something that is across all ethnicities and groups. There is, something like sex work. There are wide range of people who purchase this and people who are selling. But if there is this idea that a particular ethnic group or race is prone to criminality, then the surveillance would be directed, basically confirming the suspicions, when really that kind of activity is across all races and ethnicities. So it's not as though, let's say, somebody Black and brown communities use drugs more than white people. But if there is this idea, this cultural prejudice that that is where the crime is, then the surveillance will only be arresting and looking after that community. Or same thing with sex work. If it's viewed as something that has to do with poverty or of a particular ethnic group on this street, but doesn't even pay attention to, women of all different colors and, men, the people who are purchasing, it's not going in that direction. It's going in the direction of the poor group. And then the arrests will start to be used as some sort of evidence that this community is prone to criminality and then needs more surveillance.
And, the easiest example, even outside of just true criminal activity, is social media, right? So one of the realities of social media is it makes law enforcement surveillance much, much easier. Why? Because they can just watch what young kids are doing and posting. And young kids post dumb things all the time and have forever. But now, where are the gang units focused? They're focused on the young Black and brown kids in Chicago. Where are the prosecutions happening where, people are uploading rap songs or hip hop songs that might be alleged to involve criminal violence? Well, it's only going to be the same group of people, except now the evidence is just more available. Literally, the detective just has to sit at their computer and search on TikTok or Facebook or whatever social media platform people are using. It's the same group of people being targeted, but now there's just more evidence out there, actually made easier because many people in the younger generation have grown up posting everything they do, including some of their less than wise actions. And I think the joke of, as you were saying, Rudy, knowing that or guessing that the FBI is listening, the FBI is watching, people post things on TikTok and Instagram and Facebook or wherever the equivalent is. They're watching the groups that are already under suspicion, and then they're going to use that as evidence against them.
Yeah, that's right. And look, we've argued many times, Andrew, on this show, when stuff like this comes up or knowledge of the law. Correct me if I'm wrong. Lawyers, you automatically assume, oh, of course you know the law, you're a lawyer. Well, it's not just us. All citizens, you really can't use mistake of law as a defense. And if you try to, it's almost impossible to use it. Hey, you're born, you're in the United States, you're a citizen. Okay, you know the law. What? Who taught me the law? Well, it's on you to learn those laws. No. Now, you see, we need to do a better job about teaching civics. We need to do a better job about teaching the Fourth Amendment. We need to do a better job about teaching about rights. And we need to do a better job about teaching the dangers of your choices. We want people to think before they act because there's consequences to literally everything that you do. And your book nails that.
And on that theme, I was inspired to write it for a couple of reasons. One is, I teach criminal procedure and the Fourth Amendment and civics in that way. But part of it was I wanted to interrogate the choices we all make in our lives. You can look around your life and say all the sort of digital contact points that are in some ways unprotected. What allows us to feel that comfort? What privilege allows you to feel comfort that you don't think you're vulnerable? And isn't that wrong? Probably yes. And then what choices do you make? Are there choices that you'd make that perhaps you don't need the Ring doorbell camera that is actually recording you, 99.9% of the time, it's recording you and your family and your activities, not the other that you're afraid that might show up some point. When society records everyone's license plate and thus every car when they drive about, 99.9% of the time it's recording innocent activity, people going about their business, doing their things. Is it worth not just actual financial cost, but the privacy cost to have a society where you are recording everything and surveilling everything for the off chance that there will be some moment you need it? Because that isn't costless. It's actually real. And I want people to interrogate because it's our tax dollars that are funding these programs. It is our legislative elected representatives who literally vote yay or nay on the next surveillance technology. And I don't think we have educated ourselves enough to be able to educate them about whether they have balanced that privacy and surveillance paradigm correctly.
Andrew, your students are so lucky to have you. I love your book. It's got me thinking, this question about technology outpacing existing law. And I really enjoy the philosophical questions that are addressed when it comes to privacy and the rights of the individual. Basically, trying to hold that also with the safety of a community. And this just raises so many questions. And I appreciate the thoughtfulness. All these, this idea about power dynamics, the fact that things are inside of our home, from the seeming affordability and ease with which we use these things, not realizing the implications. I just appreciate your time so much. And thank you for the book. And thank you for joining us.
Yeah, thank you, Andrew. Thank you for the book. Thanks for writing it. Thanks for being, willing to come on. And I couldn't agree more with you about choices. And we all make them, right? I'm not going to sit here and tell you like I know all this stuff and I'm so smart and I'm perfect. I'm not. I'm also a human being that makes stupid choices as well. I got Ring cameras and I'm sure I violate the speed limit times as well. I know that we're being recorded, and it's also, you can be paranoid and that can make you sick. You just got to be smart. That's all. You just got to be smart. And I think your book really helps people with that. And that's what our message is trying to build out critical thinking skills. So we appreciate you, sir.
Thank you.
Good is in the Details is produced by Dr. Gwendolyn Dolske and Rudy Salo. Be sure to check out our show notes so that you can get a copy of Professor Ferguson's book, and you can get in touch with us at goodisinthedetails.com. Questions, pitches, collaborations, all at goodisinthedetails.com. You can find us on Instagram, Good is in the Details Pod, and Facebook. We're also on Blue Sky. And I'll have the Amazon links to Philosophy Unplugged and Interview with Intention. Perfect for the philosophy curious and someone who wants to get into podcasting. Okay, until next time, bye.